Hey y'all, I'm Hope, and today's video is going to be a little bit different. I'm actually going to be doing something I've done recently, which is we're going to play Phasmo, and I'm going to talk about something I'm interested in. I had some good feedback on my first version of this, where I was talking about House of the Good Bones. It seemed like some people really liked it, and I thought it was a lot of fun to film, so we're going to try it again. And today's topic is the Canterbury Tales, because I've been reading that for one of my classes this semester, and I am currently in the midst of writing a paper that involves the Canterbury Tales, so I'm very much been living and breathing the Canterbury Tales for the last several months, and I think that it's a text that gets kind of a bad reputation for being, intimidating or boring, things like that. That's kind of the vibe that I got talking to other people before we took this class, and definitely how I felt about it when I was kind of introduced to it the first time. I'd never heard much about it. I know some people read it in high school, but I hadn't, and just kind of have the sense that it's regarded as kind of a intimidating text or something that's kind of boring or not relevant, and I want to disagree with that. I think it's a really fun and interesting text. Emphasis on fun. Some of the stories are really wild and really interesting in terms of entertainment value. I also just think there's so much there to dig into, and I fully get why scholars today are still studying the Canterbury Tales. But that's what I want to talk about. So I want to tell you a little bit about the general setup of the tales in case you're not familiar with them, if you've never read any of them or really heard about them. I want to talk a little bit about the content warnings for it, because if you are going to read the Canterbury Tales, I feel like you deserve to be forewarned on some of the content that's in there. I want to talk about a few of the stories that I think are worth reading, even if you don't want to dig in at all. They're just entertaining and kind of weird, and they're fun to read even if you don't want to get into the more scholarly side of things. I've got a few that I think kind of fit with that. And then I want to talk about a few of the things that I find interesting that are things that I'm talking about in the paper I'm working on now, or things that I was just really engaged in when I was reading them for this class. So that's kind of the plan for today, and I'm going to go ahead and get us set up in Phasmo, and we'll get started. Okay, I have not gotten us all set up the way that I did last time. I think they've made some updates since the last time that I've played this, so I really don't know exactly how this is going to work. I don't know how to add stuff to the truck. Please do auto add. Can I put everything in the truck? I guess everything is in the truck. Okay. We are going to play an intermediate this time, because I played this several times before, and also I feel like last time we got a really boring ghost that wasn't really doing much, and I think that the entertainment value here is in me trying to talk while I'm doing things that are scary. So we're gonna up it a little bit, and we're still gonna do one of the smaller maps just because it'll be a little easier for me to manage while I'm also talking. And I have some tea here, so don't forget to get some drink and something to hydrate. Very important. I'm very bad at that. Let's go Tanglewood. It's kind of the smallest one, and I think that one will be fairly easy to navigate. We'll listen to the guy tell us the information we need, and then we'll get started. So I want to talk over the radio man.
Check the equipment and get set up before investigating. No report this time. Be careful. You're going in blind.
Delightful. Okay, so we have Anne Martin, who responds to people who are alone. Well, good news, Anne. Have a member escape during a hunt? That's not going to happen. If we get hunted, I'm dying. That is simply what's going to happen. I'm not good at getting away. Have a member of your team witness a ghost event? That's pretty easy. I am hopefully not going to have an average sanity below 25%. Okay, so let's see, where do I want to start with? Let's go with one of these. I don't remember if the breaker starts on or off in this difficulty, but of course it is in the basement. Definitely want a strong flashlight. And let's go ahead and start with let's go ahead and do a video. Well, yeah, I'm gonna take one in. Okay. Okay, so the Canterbury Tales, if you've never encountered them before, you've never read them, if you've never heard of them, I would think you probably have heard of them, but then again, I always think that things that I know about are normal, and I'm often wrong about that. So, yeah, breaker's off. So the Canterbury Tales is a text from the late 1400s, somewhere in like the 1390s, I think. I cannot remember the specific date of writing at the moment, but it's written in the late 1300s, kind of the later part of the Middle Ages, and well, I found our cursed object. The kind of setup of it is that we have a bunch of pilgrims. I think it's like 24 of them, a huge number of pilgrims, who are all just throwing shit over here. My goodness. I've been in here for like 30 seconds, bro. What are you throwing? Maybe it's in the garage. Anyway, a bunch of pilgrims meet up at a bar before going on pilgrimage. That's kind of the basic setup. And the narrator is supposed to be like Geoffrey Chaucer. And this is a fun and interesting thing in English studies, is that you can like have something like the Canterbury Tales, which is being narrated by Chaucer, but it's not like narrated by Chaucer the author, it's narrated by narrator Chaucer, who can be a different entity entirely. I think we found our ghost. It is throwing things around. I don't remember how to put things down. There we go. It's throwing shit around in the kitchen. That's exciting. Anyway, you can have things that are like written by a narrator who is like narrator Chaucer, and that's his narrator persona, which isn't necessarily the same person as Chaucer. I just think that's a fun and interesting thing in English studies, and it really adds an interesting layer when you start digging into stories and considering the way that like the narrator is different from the author. But anyway, narrator Chaucer meets a bunch of people in a bar and goes on pilgrimage with them. And as they're going around, the host of the bar, I guess, I don't know, the pilgrimage host, I can't remember what exactly his role is. I think he owns the tavern that they're in. But he decides he's going to go with them on the pilgrimage, which is a 3-day trip from the bar that they're meeting him in, which is right outside of London, to Canterbury, and then back again. And he's going to go with them on this trip. And they're going to have a contest, which is everybody has to tell 3 stories on the way there and 3 stories on the way back, because it's a very long trip. And they're going to, at the end of that, have a decision from the host of which story was the best. And then whoever has the best story gets treated to a big feast paid for by all of the other pilgrims. It's just like, it's a game. And so all the pilgrims are like, alright, sure. And the host kind of sets up the rules for the game, and then they set off. And the general prologue starts off by giving us, like, descriptions of every pilgrim. There's what they're called the portraits of each pilgrim, and some of them are very short, where we only get, like, a line or two about them that's just like, yeah, this guy was there. And then other ones will be much longer, and will tell us, like, a lot about the personality of the character, or a lot of them have something called the incongruous detail, which is that you'll have a description that's completely normal, but then there's one thing that kind of makes you pause and kind of go, wait, hang on a second, what? One of the easiest examples of this that we talked about in my class for a little while to kind of get to grips with this structure is that, like, there's a cook, and the description for the cook is all about how he is just a fabulous cook. He's really good at his job, and he makes all of these great dishes, he's really knowledgeable, all these great qualities. Also, by the way, he has, like, a massive leaking sore on his leg. And that kind of comes out of nowhere. And that one's really obvious. My favorite, the one that I'm interested in, that I'm talking about a little bit in my paper, is the knight, who is the first pilgrim introduced. He's also the first pilgrim who tells a story. And the knight is interesting in that, like, he's described as this really chivalrous, just, like, the ideal knight. He is the coolest knight ever. And he's been in all of these battles, and he's always been, like, at the head of the table because he's such a cool and good knight. And then also there's this detail near the end of his description that tells us he's going on pilgrimage immediately after returning home from the Crusades. All the battles he's been in have been specifically Crusades battles, and he's going on pilgrimage, like, the moment he gets back. And during this time, if you aren't familiar with some of the Catholic practices during this time, he technically would have been considered, like, absolved of his sins for having participated in the pilgrimage, wasn't quite the same, or sorry, not the pilgrimage, the crusade. It was not quite the same as pilgrimage, but the terms used for them come from the same root word. So it is kind of seen as being similar. And so it's interesting that he's coming back from the Crusades and has decided that he needs to, come on. Decided that he needs to, like, be absolved of sins. That scared the shit out of me. Alrighty. I'm just gonna keep walking away. It broke a light. I didn't even see what happened. I was like, I'm not looking at that. No way, no how. Anyway, we get all these portraits of the different characters, and then we get into the tales. And I think that it's an interesting setup, because it's kind of fun. It's like, the whole thing is a game, and the pilgrims are just, like, participating in this, which is basically like a long road trip, and the game is intended to kind of keep everybody entertained on this, like, 3-day horse ride all the way to Canterbury, and then 3 days back. And so I think it's a fun setup, and there's a lot of interesting details in the prologue, and I think it's a compelling opening in that, like, it's fun to learn about all of the different characters. Because they're all very different. Oh, it's throwing shit again. I've lost my train of thought. Give me a moment. Oh, we got dots. I did not notice if it was... What's my sanity like? It's pretty good. Anyway, general prologue gives way to The Knight's Tale, and that's kind of where we start, which is, I think, it's an interesting opening because The Knight's Tale is actually just, like, incredibly long, and I would argue not the most interesting story in the collection, although I would say that I personally really like it. It's weird and interesting in that, like, it's a very typical chivalric romance, but it's so long that the like, right after The Knight's Tale, the host is like, can we have something shorter now, please? Maybe something, like, a little more uplifting, or, you know, not that great tale, great story, my dude, but, like, let's not have anything quite that long anymore. And I think it is the longest of the ones that we read. I think The Parson's Tale is also quite long, but we didn't read that one. But the Knight's Tale, I think, kind of helps me transition into things that I think are worth reading, regardless of whether you want to dig into them or not, because I think The Knight's Tale is one of them. I think it's a fun story if you're at all interested in, like, what a typical chivalric romance is like. It's basically following two cousins who get captured in war by Theseus, and they fall in love with the same woman and have this big rivalry about it. That's kind of the setup, and I don't want to give away too much of the story because I think some interesting things happen with the story. But yeah, it's like a typical chivalric romance, and I think it's an interesting one if you're just interested in seeing, like, what the genre is like. Now we go. So there is that. And then some of the other ones that I think are really just fun to read are, like, The Miller's Tale, which is one of the earlier ones. Hang on a second, let me harass a ghost for a second. Are you here? Are you friendly? Where are you? It is not picking me up. Let's see. Are you here? Are you friendly? Where are you? Are you here? I'm sorry if this is loud. Are you here? Are you friendly? Where are you? Hello? Are you friendly? Where are you? Okay. I think that's a no on Spirit Box. Either that or it's just having trouble understanding me. So back to The Miller's Tale. The Miller's Tale is one that's kind of fun because I think if you go in thinking, like, oh, the Canterbury Tales is going to be boring, you're going to be taken off guard by Miller's Tale, because Miller's Tale is a fablio, which is, like, a very kind of raunchy, over-the-top story, and I think it's a French genre, if I'm remembering correctly, but it's essentially about he's not a miller. what is his job? I think he's a carpenter. And there's a carpenter who, like, he marries this young woman, and he's really jealous over her. I did not mean to throw that. I am so bad at the controls here. He's really jealous over her, but she ends up having an affair with the clerk who is renting one of their rooms. And the story follows this, like, really outlandish story that they use to trick him. And it's really gross in some ways. It's really funny. There's some really, like, not quite taboo, but kind of taboo stuff that happens near the end of the story. And it's very silly, especially coming off the heels of The Knight's Tale, because it is the next tale that happens. So it's just really interesting that it, like, you get this kind of chivalric romance, and then you get kind of the opposite of that in the very next story. So I think The Miller's Tale is one that's just fun to read. It's one that I've read before as well. I'd already encountered it once before for a class, and I'd read a translated version. I don't think I mentioned this, but we had to read them in the original Middle English for my class, although we did have access to an interlinear translation. And that being said, I'm going to post the interlinear translation we used down in the description below, so if you want to check out any of these stories, you can do that really easily. It's from Harvard, and it's got, like, the Middle English line, and then you'll have the English translation directly below that, the, like, modern English translation. So it's really easy to read it that way, and I think they're worth giving a shot because they're just really weird. And then, let's see, the other tales that I wanted to mention, or the next two tales I wanted to mention, I notice I have 3 left, but 2 of them are paired. The next 2 I want to mention are the Friar and the Summoner, because you have these 2 characters, the Friar and the Summoner, who are kind of this, like, they're not lay people, but they're, like, let's see, got any ghostwriting? We do not have ghostwriting. Lots of plates on the floor. They're part of the clergy social class, but they kind of hate each other, and they have this ongoing argument with each other where they're just constantly poking and prodding at each other and arguing and kind of, I think, annoying the rest of the pilgrims. But you get this bit of tales where you're in the middle of an arc that's all about marriage. You have a bunch of marriage tales. Starts with the Man of Law's tale, goes to the Wife of Bath, and then all of a sudden you have the Friar and the Summoner before you go back out to, I think it's the Clerk. So you have all these tales about marriage, and in the middle you have the Friar and the Summoner just having, like, this little argument about each other, or with each other, about each other, because the Friar tells a story about a Summoner, and the Summoner tells a story about a Friar, and both of the tales are really insulting and mean. So you have the Friar tell the tale of a Summoner who meets a demon on the road and makes a bad deal with him, and then you have the Summoner who kind of escalates things even further, and he's like, well, I might have gotten dragged to hell, but, like, you live in hell. And then he tells a story about a friar who is just trying to, like, get a monopoly on confessions in this town, and kind of meets his match in one of the local men who's kind of sick of his shit. Pardon my language, by the way. It's this really funny moment where the 2 characters are just kind of, like, attacking each other. And, like, it has nothing to do with, like, what the other characters are doing. They're having this, like, lovely arc about, like, different philosophies on marriage, and then the Friar and the Summoner are like, hey, we've got to like, deal with our hatred of each other real quick. Don't mind us. So I think that's really a funny moment, especially the way the 2 interact, and they're both pretty short tales, so I'd say if you're gonna read one, like, read both. They're pretty short and they're easy to get through. And let's see, I don't see any gorbs. Sorry, I realize I should be probably looking for clues, right? I'm not seeing any gorbs, so I think we're gonna say no for gorbs. So it's an Oni or a Goryo, which is gonna be hard to figure out. Delightful. What else do we need to figure out either of them? Oh, right. Okay, freezing. It's not going to be ghostwriting for either of those, so we can just say no on that. Goryo would give fingerprints. And Oni would give us freezing. Okay. So I think in that case, let's grab this. And where did I put my... There we go. Okay. So the last tale that I want to mention as one that's really funny, I don't know if I just cut off mid-sentence, and I apologize if I did, but I was pretty much done with the Friar and the Summoner. They're just kind of having their own little issue with each other. We got fingies. Problem solved. We got fingies. So it's Goria. I probably could have figured that out earlier if I had put down the dots and then, like, held the camera, because it's been doing dots a lot, and the Gorios only do dots on the camera. But, like, I didn't do that. So, anyway, now we know it's Gorio, and I am refusing to do these other two things. So, let's go find out if we're right. But the last story that I think is really fun to read, regardless of whether you want to think about it in, like, a scholarly level, is the Nun's Priest Tale, which is basically a beast fable. Also, we're correct. We got it. It's a Gorio. It is a beast fable based on, I think it's The Fox and the Crow by Aesop, and it's a story about a talking rooster named Chanticleer and his favorite wife, Pertolote, and a fox whose name I cannot remember. But there's, like, this whole thing about, like, dreams as omens, and you get the kind of, like, funny interaction between the chicken and the fox, and it's just, like, it's a fun time. It's a talking chicken story, and I think that, like, even if you don't want to dig any deeper than just the moral that it gives you at the end, I think it's a fun one to read, because it's a beast fable, and I always think those are kind of entertaining. So those are maybe, like, the 5 stories I would most recommend if you aren't interested in, like, digging in any further. It'd be The Knight's Tale, The Miller's Tale, The Friar and the Summoner, and The Nun's Priest Tale, because I think those are entertaining without going any further than, like, just reading them for fun. Or, you know, going any further than, like, the surface level reading of them. I think those are just entertaining stories. Before you read any of them, I do want to mention that I would say for all of the Canterbury Tales, there's kind of in general content warnings for xenophobia, rape, and sexual assault. There's quite a bit of that, which is also why I did not recommend the tale that goes with the Miller's Tale. I can't remember who tells it, but there's, like, a response to the Miller that's goes a little far on that one, but definitely xenophobia, rape, sexual assault, misogyny for sure in, like, every one of the stories, and then anti-Semitism, particularly for the Prioress's story. There aren't a whole lot of depictions of Jewish people in these stories, but when they are, they're pretty anti-Semitic, and so I would say just know those things going in. I would say that of these, you're relatively safe. Of those, in those 5, you're definitely going to have some, like, misogyny as an issue in some of these, particularly the Nun's Priest. His story has a whole rant against women in the middle of it, so there is definitely some misogyny, but I think for the most part those 5 are not quite as difficult in that way as a lot of the other tales are. So I feel like those ones are relatively safe. I apologize, I am blowing out my microphone over here. I can see it, like, going all the way to the red, so I'm just going to push that back so I'm not quite so loud. Apologies for the shift in audio, and if I have already ruined your day and you're wearing headphones, I apologize. So, anyway, just know those things going in to any of the tales. I think let's do one more run here. And I will pull up my notes on the things that I think are interesting from having taken this class and talking about it, like.
Take a look at the equipment and prepare accordingly before starting the investigation. Got the intel. Looks like this is going to be a tough one. We've had reports of violence, and it looks like they left in a hurry.
Great. Okay, we've got Harold White, who responds to everyone. I am everyone, so it's fine. Repel the ghost with a smudge stick while chasing someone. Please don't let me do that. Capture a photo and detect a paranormal sound. Okay. Those seem relatively doable. Let's go ahead and get that, and flashlight. Yep. Okay. So, having taken this class on the Canterbury Tales, I feel like I've grown to appreciate them a lot more than I did when I first started, and the couple of times before that I've read bits and pieces of it for other classes. And so there's 2 kind of, like, major themes that I find interesting. I did not look to see where the breaker was. That's okay. Be in here? Yes. Success. Okay. So... Oh. My very first whisper. I'm gonna go put this away now. I don't want to hear that ever again. Delightful. The kind of, like, first thing that I think was really interesting, or the first thing I want to talk about, because it's a little bit shorter, is issues of justice in this. In particular, we read this really interesting article. We read the Wife of Bath's tale. And the Wife of Bath is an interesting character in that, for one thing, she's the only character who's mentioned by, like, where she's from as opposed to, like, her occupation. Hi, Elwood. I'm gonna need you to not come up here right now, buddy. Elwood wants to help. But she is this really interesting character who comes in and has this whole rant about how, like, virginity is great and all, but it's not for everyone. And anyway, she's had 5 husbands. She regrets nothing. She's just an interesting lady. Comes in, talks about all of that, tells us, like, a long story about all of her different husbands, ending with her 5th husband, who was her favorite, even though they had kind of an abusive relationship with each other. But they kind of worked their issues out. And she and this guy, his name is Jenkin, like, have this ongoing debate where he's constantly, like, reading to her from this book called The Book of Wicked Wives and telling her why she should, like, not behave the way she's behaving, which is, like, the way she's behaving is how they got together in the first place. So he's kind of being a hypocrite. And there's, like, an altercation, and she kind of gets her way, and they have, like, almost a happily ever after. And then at some point he dies, because by the time she gets to the pilgrimage, she's looking for her 6th husband. So we get all of that backstory on the Wife of Bath, and then she tells this very interesting story within that context that, like, it's about a knight. And this is where some of the, like, content warnings come in, because the knight rapes a woman, and he doesn't ever really get any kind of punishment for that action. He is brought before the king, and the king is going to sentence him to execution. But then the queen is like, hey, let me handle this. This is King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, by the way. And so the queen is like, let me give this a shot. I have some ideas here. And the king is like, all right, go for it. And so she takes control of this, like, trial for the night. And she's like, I'm going to give you a question. And if you can answer it in the next year, you won't be put to death. You won't be executed. You have 1 year to figure out the answer to this question. And if you can't figure it out, you'll be executed. Or if you don't want to do this, you'll be executed. And he's like, okay, I'll take your challenge. I'll find out the answer to this question. And she gives him the question, what do women want most? And so he goes about trying to, like, figure out what he's going to do about this, because he's asking everyone, and of course, various women have different answers, because women are not a monolith. And so he has all these different answers. He's really struggling until he meets an old hag, I believe is how she's described, who offers to tell him what the answer is in exchange for his agreeing to whatever she chooses. She doesn't tell him what exactly it is. He just owes her a favor. Like, the first thing that she requests, he will have to give to her. And that's her, that is her agreement with this knight. And so the knight is like, yeah, sure. I've just realized I set all this up in the wrong spot. Hang on a second. Oh my god. There we go. And so knight makes the agreement. She gives him the answer. And then, of course, her agreement, once he's been freed, because he gives the answer to the queen, and the queen's like, yep, this seems good. The answer being that women want sovereignty over their husbands, which is very Wife of Bath. And he gives the queen the answer, and the woman leaps up and she's like, okay, well, I gave him that answer, and my demand is that he has to marry me. And so he is, of course, forced to marry her. And at the end, she gives him a choice of either I can be pretty during the day and everybody will always want me, or I can be pretty at night and everyone will judge you for being with an old hag. And he learns his lesson. He goes, okay, I'm giving you the choice. This is your life. You decide. And she's like, cool, well, that's the correct answer. I'm going to be pretty all of the time. And he kind of lives happily ever after. Which is, again, kind of frustrating in that, like, he's committed a pretty awful crime and he gets away with it in a lot of ways. But what makes it, I think, interesting is that there's this, not what I think makes it interesting, but, like, what was interesting to me when we were talking about this is that we read an article, I don't know why I'm leaving, we read an article about this, which was talking about how the story articulates, like, an alternative kind of justice that is based in, like, contracts, where there's all of these different contracts that happen throughout the story, and it's all, like, this kind of feminine justice that's opposed to, like, the masculine justice of King Arthur's court. It was just a really fascinating article. It was this idea that, like, there's a justice here that's almost kind of similar to, I would say, like, restorative justice initiatives now, where the goal was to, like, both have the knight come to a point of accountability for what he had done, but also to, like, reintegrate him into the community, which I think is really interesting, and it's all done through, like, contracts formed by various women in the story. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective, and I really enjoyed the discussion on that one. So I would say The Wife of Bath's Tale is another one that's interesting to read. It's not real long either, and I did give you kind of a brief summary, but there's a lot of details that I have left out here because there is a lot to unpack in any of the Canterbury Tales. I keep dropping my flashlight when I'm trying to turn it off. Delightful. The other kind of major thing that I'm interested in the Canterbury Tales that I personally have been writing about a little bit in the paper that I'm working on is religious conflict and how that's being used to justify violence. Because the church during this period was involved in kind of two different directions of conflict, of kind of, like, defining itself through the way it conflicted with other groups. And it's doing it in one way of like, conflict with other religions, with, like, the Crusades and the kind of violent destruction of, subsuming of Muslims and Jews in Europe and beyond. But there's also this push to deal with heresy during this time. And, did it fucking move? It's not here anymore. Oh, it's in the bathroom. Okay, well. Freezing temps. That would explain why I heard something move in there a few minutes ago. And then, there was a lot of debate about, like, heretics and what counted as heresy, those kinds of questions at this time. And that's one of the things that I'm interested in as well. So there's this kind of two-pronged effort to define itself through excluding others. Hang on a second, let's do this. Are you here? Are you friendly? Are you French? Where are you? Are you here? Are you friendly? Where are you? Are you here? Are you friendly? I think we are no for Spirit Box again. I've not gotten a Spirit Box ghost on this yet, and I'm kind of scared of the day that I do get one while I'm filming. Anyway, Where was I? Ah, yeah, the two-pronged efforts to, like, define themselves to exclusion. That's very much like what my paper I'm currently working on is about. But what's interesting to me about this is that, I'm not picking it up this time, is that there's this kind of interesting thing going on in the Canterbury Tales where those elements are there, but they're not as, like, prevalent as they are in other pieces of medieval literature. And they're a little more, like, embedded, and you have to kind of pull things apart to really get at them in a way that you don't have to do with, like, for my paper I've been reading The King of Tars and Sir Gowther, which are both stories that are very much about, like, characters who are redeemed when their violence turns towards, like, the correct group, so it becomes directed at, I think in both cases of that, it's Muslims in both of those stories, but sorry, I'm looking for corpse. There's elements of it in Chaucer that I think are really interesting. You get a little bit with the knight and his kind of description, because he has this whole long list of battles he's been in, and it's kind of like, it's touching the door. He's this really great knight. He's such a chivalrous dude. And then if you look up any of the stuff that he's listed as having been, like, participated in, it's all pretty awful. Like, it's the siege of Alexandria is kind of the first thing that gets mentioned, but he's involved in, like, some pretty horrible battles, including also the siege of Algiers, or Algeciras, I think is how it's spelled in there, where 30,000 people were cut off from supplies and food for almost 2 years. So, like, there's pretty horrific stuff in his CV that, like, just kind of gets glossed because it's structured as being, sorry, I thought I heard my mom come home. I can't tell if I did or not. Sorry, if I start doing this, freaking myself out. There's pretty horrific stuff there. The other things that I think, like, we get it most obviously in, like, The Prioress's Tale, which is very anti-Semitic. That's why it's one that I would not necessarily recommend to read, because I think it is deeply unpleasant. Shut the fucking door. Pardon my language, but that rude ghost. Shut the door. Okay, well. Actually, it's just, what's my sanity? We're good. I think even if it's a demon, it can't hunt me yet, so. It sure is fingies. Sorry. The Prioress's Tale involves the story of a young child who is, murdered. I think the story frames it as he's murdered by the Jewish people that live in his community, but weirdly, there is a 14th century hitman who is the one who really does the murder, so I don't know what is going on there, but, oh, he's opening the door again. There's a 14th century hitman in the midst of all of this, and, it's a pretty dark story, and I think it's interesting in the sense that, like, I need EMF, just gonna go ahead and do that, just to be careful. It's a pretty dark story, and there's a sense almost that, like, the prioress herself is not comfortable with the violence in her own story, because she like, focuses on the details, but all of the deaths in the story are pretty, they're glossed over pretty quickly. Like, the actual murders on both sides, the murder of the child and the execution of the community, it's all pretty glossed over. That it all happens in, like, a couple of lines, and then she spends a lot more time talking about, like, the specifics of, like, the wounds and things on the child, but his actual death is quite short. So there's this weird relationship with violence in that particular story, but it's really unpleasant to read and is not one I would really recommend at all. I have read it twice now and I've hated it both times, so not a story I would ever really recommend to anybody to read for any reason. And then the one that I'm most interested in that I'm going to be writing about for my now that I'm back, it's not doing anything. That I'm writing about for my story is The Man of Law's Tale, which is about a woman named Constance who that scared me. Not getting any EMF 5 so far, but I don't know that we're not getting any at all. So it follows Constance, who's like the daughter of the Roman emperor, and she gets sent off to marry this sultan who has heard about how cool and virtuous she is. And she goes off to marry him, and then there's lots of violence happening there where he converts, but then his mother has him and a bunch of other people killed at the wedding, and then Constance is set out to sea, and then she goes somewhere else and she converts British pagans, and then she gets set out to sea again, and then she ends up returning to Rome and ultimately is reunited with her husband, who was one of the pagans that she had converted. So it's very much a story of conversion, but there's this weird and interesting thing happening with like the violence in it, with the like, religious violence in it, because we get a lot of justification actually for why the Sultaness, who is never named, that's just what she's called in the story, why she has her son and these other people executed, which is very much that she sees his conversion as like an attack on her own faith and a danger to her people. And so she has this really interesting speech where she talks about why she's doing this. And I think that she, in the other stories that I have read that have elements of this, like the King of Tars and Sir Gathar, you don't get that kind of justification on the part of anybody who isn't Christian. And so there's this interesting point where she gets to justify her actions, and I really think that she's a compelling character. We also have some interesting stuff with like the violence perpetuated by the Christian characters, where Constance, it's from a story that's about like the Constance story, which has been told many different ways and different times, but there's a version of it. But Constance, she only ever converts through like peace. Like she never hurts anybody, she's never accusing anybody of anything, things happen around her that cause other people to convert. And so that's always happening to her. But there's a lot of violence that happens around her. First of all, the Sultan and his kind of court being executed, that's one bit of violence that happens kind of towards her. But then later on, a knight falsely accuses her of having killed somebody because he's angry at her, and when he is asked to swear that he saw what he saw, a giant hand comes out of the sky and beats him on the back of the head so hard his eyes pop out and like explode. Like, he's dead. And that scene is like a justified bit of violence in the story, but is also really horrific and described in more detail than like most anything else. Sorry, I'm looking at this hoping that I'm going to get some information, but I don't really want to go back in there. We've not been getting ghostwriting, so I think it's going to be a no on ghostwriting, but plus I think a demon could have hunted at any point now. Anyway, that happens, and then there's also this really interesting bit where, kind of contrasted with the murder of the Sultan and his court by his mother to kind of protect her religion, I think that's been thrown. It's not ghostwriting. We get this, on the other side of things, we get this passage where Constance is returning home, and she is picked up by a Roman senator who doesn't know who she is, who is like on his way home from having gone to the land where she had originally been sent and killing the Sultaness. And rather than like the kind of contained violence that we get with the Sultaness killing all of the people who've converted, we get this really long section about how he's returning victorious from having gone to this land and slaughtered and burned for many a day. And it's this really dark passage, but it's just kind of like, it's there. and it's put in like way more detail, or way more like lines than the actual murder at the wedding. But then it's like glossed over, because then it's just like, oh, well, Custance gets on the ship with him and he goes back to Rome. So there's some really interesting stuff happening with that, because it almost, the two religions almost seem to be on like a similar level, but the Christian violence is much more prevalent in the story than any violence by either the Muslim court or by the pagans in England. Like, the violence perpetuated by the Christians is more prevalent in the story by far. So I think that there's some interesting stuff happening there with the like religious conflict. So that's kind of what I'm writing about in my paper, and one of the things that I found most interesting to kind of go through and like reread the stories and look at how this was being kind of threaded through. Also, I'm going to guess Jen, and we're going to go find out if we're right, because I am kind of at the end of my points here, but I just think that the Canterbury Tales is really interesting, and I don't think it really deserves its reputation of being, like, difficult, especially with really good interlinear translations being available. You can read them in, like, modern English. I don't think the Middle English is that hard. We got that completely wrong. Good job. I did great. Got that. It was wrong. It was a Hantu. But we did get some good rewards, because I got the parabolic microphone thing, so I got $10 for that. But yeah, I think that Canterbury Tales is a really fun and interesting text, and we'll just swap back here to the outro. It's a fun and interesting text. I think it's worth trying if you have any interest in it at all. I think that medieval literature as a whole is really fun and interesting. I mentioned already The King of Tars and Sir Gauthur. Those are both really wild stories. Very strange things happen in them. Obviously, they have some content warnings for xenophobia and, actually, I think, rape, definitely, in Sir Gauthur, murder. There's lots of content warnings, but they're really weird texts, and that tends to be the thing that I most enjoy about medieval texts, is that they're all kind of weird. There's always these elements of, like, fantasy and the supernatural and things like that that are happening in these texts that I think that make them just really interesting to read. Sir Gauthur's about a guy who is the son of a demon, and he finds out about it and, like, goes on this quest to seek forgiveness after having been, like, a horrible person for many years. And then The King of Tars is about a woman who, it's very similar to the Custance story. She gets sent off to marry a sultan, and although for her it happens after a war between the sultan and her father, and she decides to go voluntarily because of the people that have died during this war. So it's about her, and, like, there's a baby involved that is formless. There's, like, a what's in the notes referred to as a lump child that has no limbs and no face, so that's, like, a really weird thing that happens. There's just lots of very strange stuff in medieval literature. Another one I've read is Bisclevre by Marie de France, which is about a guy who's a werewolf, and his wife, like, he has to have his clothes to turn back from a werewolf into a human, and so his wife hides his clothes one day, and he gets trapped as a werewolf, and it's about, like, his journey to becoming a human again, and it's just all really bizarre and fun to read in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways it can be quite dark, and, again, content warnings for so many things, but I think medieval literature is not as scary as it's made out to be, and I think it's much more approachable now, especially now having read some of it. And in fact, I read the last two stories completely in Middle English, The King of Tars and Sir Gauthur, and it really wasn't that bad. It took a little while to kind of get in the flow of things, but it wasn't that bad. And there's a lot of times when you can kind of guess what a word or what a sentence means, because it is Middle English and it's still technically English, so it's got some overlap with the way that we talk today, and some words are similar. So I think it's really not that bad, and I really highly recommend, if you're at all interested, or if any of this has intrigued you, I highly recommend checking those out. I will put the interlinear translation for the Canterbury Tales, which is the full text as we have it, because we don't actually have the whole thing. Pieces of it are missing, and as it stands, there was originally supposed to be, like, I think 6 stories per pilgrim, and there's really only 1 for most of the pilgrims. So, yeah, there's pieces missing. It's a long, interesting text, but I'll put the link for that, and I'll put the links for The King of Tars and Sir Gauthur in the description down below as well, because those are all, like, free to access. They're on websites that are making, well, not the Harvard one. Harvard one's just the translation, but the other 2 are on a site that's doing these, like, augmented text, where there's, like, stuff that you can scroll over, and it gives you, like, all the notes and things like that, and gives you more information on certain words. So all really interesting. I'll link those in the description down below in case you want to check them out. But I hope that you guys have enjoyed this video. This has been fun for me to film. Probably going to be less fun for me to edit because I can see I've been filming for 47 minutes. But it was a lot of fun to film, and I hope you guys are going to enjoy this format. I'm hoping to do some more of this going forward. I'd like to try out some other games as well, other things that I might be able to play while I'm talking. So if you have any recommendations, leave them in the comments down below. And if you have any thoughts on the Canterbury Tales or other texts that you think are of interest that somebody might want to check out, leave that in the comments below as well. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video. And if you have, I hope you'll consider giving it a like and maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting every Tuesday and Saturday, so there is more content coming soon, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.